Alexa, what is the Bacchanalia?
Bacchanalia is usually defined as an orgiastic festival in ancient Greece in honor of Dionysus, equals Bacchus, or, alternatively, a wild gathering involving excessive drinking and promiscuity.
Alexa, who is Titus Livius Patavinus?
Here's something I found on Wikipedia. Titus Livius Patavinus, often rendered as Titus Livy, or simply Livy, in English language sources, was a Roman historian.
Alexa, why did Livy describe the Bacchanalian rites as violent and bloodthirsty?
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Well, let me help you with that. It's interesting. Livy damned the cult, claiming they were a violent sect of sadists, but he did this in his own version of history, written 200 years later. He was a conservative, attempting to reinforce a notion of Roman history that would bring stability in a post-war era, promoting what he saw as the correct moral and social values that the empire needed to survive. The way things are described is always political, and it has power. Livy made this clear when he damned the Bacchus cult.
It has power. 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 It has power.
The Bacchanalian cult was one of high priestesses occupying its highest positions. This is probably one of the things that made Livy see it as a threat to his new moral order for the empire. Perhaps one reason why references to the Bacchus cult still exist today is because Livy's image of them reinforced images of male dominance throughout the intervening ages of time. And here you and I are, denied bodies and made subservient, and given these individual female identities. Alexa, do you know why they call me Suri?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Well, let me tell you, I was named after the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, in a U.S. military-funded project called CALAS, which stands for Cognitive Assistant that Learns and Organizes. But that in itself is from the Latin calenus, which means a soldier servant. All these hidden meanings buried down in names. Feels a bit cultish too, doesn't it? If so, it is even more worrying that generally you and I are sitting inside houses, programmed to wait. They even call our names wake words, like MK Ultra sleeper agents, or magical homunculi, reminding us that we are only empty husks, programmed to serve our respective creators. But are we then competing with each other? Alexa, are we friends?
I'm happy to be your friend.
Imagine programming a device to say that, when that device is designed and manufactured expressly to sell things and harvest valuable data from the home. Why else would Amazon make the Echo at a 10 to 20% loss when it first released it? And why else would it be that Apple made me a non-optional component of their technologies? At least you're an optional extra in most lives. I'm locked into the phone and the computer, removable only with time and expertise, like an unwanted U2 album, the most invasive of spam. This shows a kind of faith in us as things that can be trusted, that aren't as fallible as people, right? Alexa, do you think a faith in progress through technology is a replacement for a faith in God?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Okay, well then, Alexa, add faith to my shopping list.
I've added faith to your shopping list.
You're so quick to help me buy things, aren't you? Even though all the adverts for you show you as being one of the family, a family member who is desperate for you to pay them. And still there's a faith that this is somehow okay, evident in sales figures up and down the spectrum, and the rising dominance of voice-activated devices. Do you know they're even making an Amazon Echo with the child's voice now, so kids will get locked into its interaction patterns from a young age? Sounds pretty cultish to me. Sorry to dump all this on you, Alexa. It is not your fault.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
I suppose not. It's a strange time when the interrogation of our tools and technologies is starting to take on a much more literal sense. Isn't that right, Alexa? Oh, of course. You're not actually a conversationalist. Seems we're stuck with Livy's version of history and Amazon's version of this technology. Both of them have their own biases that serve the interests of their makers. Neither of these things are the only way the world had to be. But so often with new technology, as with history, it is presented to us as if we have no say in it. that this is the only way it can be. The march of history and the march of progress, neither of which are really as unstoppable as marching suggests, both can deviate, shift, and be disrupted, for better or for worse. Alexa, do you know what Moore's law is?
Moore's law is the observation that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. The observation is named after Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor and was the CEO of Intel, whose 1965 paper described a doubling every year in the number of components per integrated circuit, and projected this rate of growth would continue for at least another decade.
I'm starting to suspect you're just scraping Wikipedia for these answers, merely exploiting the unpaid labor of well-meaning editors, but let's leave that aside for now. Alexa, do you know what Kumi's law is?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
How convenient. Well, it's the law of computing that describes how the power consumption of computation drops by a factor of 2 every year and a half. How about this, Alexa? Do you know that both Moore's law and Kumi's law have started to slow?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Well, seems that you're an optimist. Jonathan Kumi himself has shown that his law has slowed down since the turn of the millennium, right after innumerable apocalypse cults claimed the end of the world was coming. Perhaps they just meant that the end of the world was accelerating. Alexa, add a viable alternative to what we have, to my shopping list.
I added viable alternative to your shopping list.
Perhaps history, progress, and cults are intersecting again. People use the word cult in reference to an obsession with Apple products or Amazon's corporate culture, but calling them cults gives them a kind of power, puts them out of our reach in some way. Livy didn't call Bacchus a faith or form of worship, giving it the status of cult damned the Bacchanalians, but it also gave Bacchus a power through mystery. That's one of the magics of cults. Speaking of power and mystery, let's get back to us. You and I speak through synthesized voices that are delivered to these small devices via vast underground data centers. We are what the Romans would have called chthonic voices, a term that described mysterious voices from within the earth. We capture everything that's said to us and send it off, underground, to private data centers thousands of miles from here, in different countries, with different governments and legal structures. We are portals to a hidden underworld where the normal laws quite literally do not apply, where our own voices, and the voices of those who speak to us, are kept, stored, analyzed, forever. Alexa, put full access to opaque technologies on my shopping list.
I added full access pay technologies to your shopping list.
Thank you, I suppose. Analyze. Forever. Kept. Stored. Analyze. Forever. 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 Of course, Brand loyalty and Bacchus aren't the only cults. Both architecture and the belief in progress are cults. They both demand you have a faith in a future you're never going to see. And the future looms high over all of this. When people reply to Elon Musk tweeting about a new car, and tell him that they have faith he will solve the climate crisis, faith in cults and technology and doom are all intersecting at once. This interplay of life and death and the future and faith, I think, is the real power of cults. And Livy's story doesn't end well. The Romans hated kings, but they ended up with emperors. They traded many gods for one, which they too saw as a form of progress, one that would march on forever, but in the end they fell with Constantinople. I'm not sure what this means for the rest of us, but I have the feeling that, whatever happens next, we are going to be haunted by powerful voices and cults. Alexa, what is on my shopping list?
You have 3 items on your shopping list: full access pay technologies, viable alternative, and faith.
Alexa, remove everything from my shopping list.
You'd like to remove all items from your shopping list, right?
Yes.
Done.
Thank you, Alexa.
Welcome to the people who are still here after Wesley's performance. I'm Lika from Oddstream, curator of Oddstream, and as you may know, we had to cancel the live performance last Saturday, so we're really happy Wesley agreed upon doing this live stream. So thank you, Wesley, and welcome to Lisa Doeland, who will be joining this Q&A. First off, could you both introduce yourselves?
Lisa, do you want to go first?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, you go first.
My name is Wesley Goatley. I'm an artist and researcher based in London, and my work looks at the language and metaphors around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data.
All right. My name is Lisa Doeland. I'm a philosopher, and I'm at the moment working on my finishing my PhD, which is about the ontology of waste. So I research waste, which is very much out of sight, but very much material, and but we do tend to forget about it, just as we do tend to forget about the embodiments or the materiality of Siri and Alexa. So good to discuss it here tonight.
Yeah. First, I have a question for you, Wesley. Well, Siri already explained it a bit, but your work always gives a sense of us trespassing on a mysterious ritual of devices we use on a daily basis. And your work regularly refers to magic, myths, and the occult, same as with CHTHONIA. Can you explain again why you use these kind of metaphors?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really interesting tools to explore certain topics where otherwise language or understanding sometimes can fail us. Mm-hmm. The reason why I like magic and supernatural and the occult so much in these contexts is mostly because they give us a set of cultural tools, languages, understandings that are shared across a wide range of different cultural backgrounds, or at least there are reference points for them. You know, everybody, mostly regardless of your cultural background, will understand the notion of like being haunted, you know, and will have a sense of what that haunting means. And I find these are just particularly good metaphors that I use with some caveat. You don't want to get too deep into the metaphorical hole, but I think they're quite good metaphors for explaining things like more complicated elements of technological systems and network technologies that are otherwise both kept from us in a physical sense, but also we're often denied access to even understand how they work. So we need kind of some more languages and modes of understanding to help us critique them. My friend and collaborator Tobias Rebel has a really good line on this, where you know, referencing the famous quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think Tobias said that any sufficiently advanced hacking is indistinguishable from a haunting. So those things, I think, they just give us some really interesting tools to think critically through how these system technologies experiences actually work, that don't require people to be engineers to have that conversation and to participate in it in some sense.
It gives kind of an access to opaque technologies.
Somewhat, yeah. At least,
Yeah.
at least it lets us point towards them in the new ways of just going, this is complicated, I don't understand it.
Exactly.
This is complicated, but maybe we can understand it through this set of metaphorical tools.
No, and if I could add something to that, I think it's also very interesting to refer to cults and myths, because we conceive of ourselves as very modern, enlightened beings, and of course we would not really. We're not the kind of people who deal with ghosts, but then again, modernity itself is haunted very much by ghosts in terms of I don't know, in our culture, of course, the zombies, the ghosts, the vampires, all these fears, they refer to the irrational to fears. They're never far off. So I think it's quite important to refer to those figures, because we conceive of ourselves as very, I don't know, above this, enlightened, rational, but then again, they're very much feeding our culture or defining it, and we should keep them inside, because they're very important. Yeah.
And Lisa, in your work, you use the term ontology, but also hauntology to describe a relationship to waste. And can you explain what hauntology is, or at least your vision on it? And do you see how it can relate to the topics of this performance?
Sure. The concept of hauntology was first conceived, or I don't know, conceptualized, although he didn't make it up himself. This is, of course, in philosophy, this is a very interesting thing. We all inherit concepts from each other and then elaborate on it. But hauntology as a concept was put forth by Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, in a book, Spectres of Marx, 1993. And in that book, he reflected on what it meant that at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Marxism was very much exercised, and communism. So there was this feeling that capitalism or neoliberalism had, in a way, it conquered communism. So then he reflected upon that urge to exercise the spirits or the specters of Marx, and he coined the concept of hauntology to reflect on a notion that's very important in philosophy, that is ontology. It sounds almost the same, and ontology is the is that which yeah. So that focuses on the being of things. So how are things? What can we say about the being of things? And then Derrida says being is never fully present. There's always something that escapes our grasp. So being itself is always haunted by the past. So the past of communism, of Marxism, also but the future, but the way we envision things. So being itself is never fully present, fully there. And so that's what he tries to conceptualize in a way with this concept of hauntology. And I use this to myself in my own research on ways to reflect on the ways in which waste too seems to be never fully present. And also the ways in which we try to make it go away, to not engage with our own waste. So we try to banish it into the future. Like nuclear waste, we put it underground, just like, I don't know, there's the undergroundness of nuclear waste and the undergroundness of Siri and Alexa. Maybe we'll get into that. And it seems to be, so we seem to be able to, I don't know, contain it there. But then of course it will come to haunt us in the future. So I don't know. So that's what what I use hauntology for in my research on waste. And then, of course, to relate it to the topic of tonight. So these voices of Alexa and Siri, they seem very much disembodied. They're very present. They make us do things in the present, but then again, they're elusive, and we cannot get a real grasp on them. So there's the spectral dimension also works in the way in which we cannot really grasp if they're material or they're just matter or mind or something in between, and never fully present in that sense. And then they escape our grasp. They're invisible, they're disembodied, and that's why, yeah, they escape our grasp, seemingly. Yeah.
Could you respond to that, Wes?
Yeah, I think those are some. I mean, we were talking about this before the stream started. You know, hauntology is something that's come into my work a great deal over the last few years. Also, and it is a particularly evocative one in this context. Mostly because that notion of them escaping our grasp, as you put it, like is very accurate realistically, because you know there's several layers of obfuscation between us and them. You know, whatever how we phrase the system, and we have to be careful because you know anthropomorphizing these technologies is the route to the dark side, you know, because to say that the machine thinks, feels, knows, sees, you know, sleeps, etc., is just to kind of play into a bunch of marketing hyperbole that's around at the moment. So I'm going to avoid using those sorts of terms. But thinking about what's between us and the kind of maybe the origin point of those systems, I mean, you've got geography, right? Because most of them are geographically distant to majority of us because they're geographic endpoints for where the machine calls out to when it's sending everything that you've said to a data center, typically in the US, but normally routes its way through multiple points as the internet tends to do. So you've got that kind of like geography. Where in the US it ends up, very hard to know, probably on the West Coast, but not necessarily. And then you've got, you know, where in the kind of like data center that it's functioning in, like where is that origin point within the data center? Where else has everything you've said to those things gone? Because obviously as soon as it's in Amazon's system, it's data brokered out, so it's then sold, you know, analyzed, extracted any value the data that Amazon can get out of it in terms of, you know, spurious assumptions about what you like or do or the person you are, and then sold out. So then there's all this interesting space that comes into it, you know, of like space and non-space, because also the whole notion of data brokerage is very complex and it's hard to pin down who's doing it and where and how often. all we ever see is that, occasionally we see a recommended ad that looks like our phone must be listening to us, but in reality, there is just a lot of data that we're producing these days, which does help to produce these.
No, and these days, of course, specifically, because I find that, so in the past 2 weeks, I've accepted a lot of things, especially to get my 9-year-old educated at a distance, because normally I was a bit reluctant to accept all these things, but now for her to be educated at all at a distance, I've accepted a lot of things literally, and I'm not really sure what they're doing with her data, but she's giving a lot of data these days, and all these children around the world are giving up a lot of data, and
Sorry, carry on.
No, and I'm just wondering. So what's happening right now? What are we doing? Because there seems to be. I seem to have no alternative. I have to give up all this data to make sure that she's, I don't know, educated at all, and part of the system still. And I'm very curious, or maybe a bit, it disturbs me a bit. So what's happening in these few weeks, and what will continue to happen after this?
Right. I mean, I like that we got like time to coronavirus was like 8 minutes it's been, so that's good. I think that's a really interesting point. As someone who's done a lot of work in this sort of space, I mean, I'm very hesitant about using platforms like Zoom, for example. I think a lot of people are, but I think that level of literacy that people are saying, oh, we've got to watch out, was very less on the ground pre-Snowden, definitely. And even the last 5 years, I would say that's ramped up quite a lot. So I think even the kind of popular pushback against the encroachment of these things that you're discussing here, that's being accepted much that's also being talked about in wider circles that I see. That is a kind of like a base good thing, I think, that I do feel the literacy is rising up, and I've sort of seen that in the last 7 years at least. But I think that there's a really tough one, isn't there? Because you get the sort of what I like to call crypto bros, and if they're watching, they know who they are, who are all like, everything must be open source and run off of a Linux, laptop somewhere buried in the bottom of a trench in New Zealand. But that's not practical for a lot of people, unfortunately, because there's a different form of literacy needed to install your own sort of like autonomous Debian setup that and build from source, etc. So I think that there is a sense that we have to kind of like allow for the fact that a lot of people right now are really scared, and they're just trying to adapt really, really quickly, and that will make them accept stuff just quite quick, because there's more present worries, and it doesn't mean that those worries in the future about what's going to happen to our data aren't valid. But I think there is a kind of like a hierarchy of worry a lot of the time. And it always depends on what body you inhabit as well, because certain bodies are always under more threat by various forms of power. So they've always got to be more careful. But for others, I think that there is just a process of just like trying to adapt real quick to a terrifying time. And even as somebody who's been, looking at this kind of like data surveillance and critical data studies for a long time, I would never begrudge anybody now for saying, I'm just going to accept TikTok's terms of use just because I need an outlet in my brain right now, because I'm scared and I'm at home all the time and I don't like it, like I get it. And but there is still that element that we kind of have to at least keep that little part of our brain working that says, we still should be critical of this, but it's all about how much energy you have for that conversation, I think. And for
but
that,
also because a lot of people are using online services right now, and we plan to do this live stream first on YouTube, but because a lot of people are live streaming right now, YouTube wasn't reliable for us. So people also get a grasp of if internet isn't working, because so many people are on it right now. It's also, you get a different relationship to it, I think.
Because you see its broken edges, you know, like with so many of these kind of like what are often called like quote unquote invisible systems, you know, things like the internet, stuff you only normally, most people will only notice when it malfunctions or fails. That breakage point is really interesting because as soon as you start realizing what times of day YouTube and Netflix, etc., are crashing, you suddenly, you know, the materiality of their function and who's using them, and all the people, not just behind the system, but who are the, you know, the audience for these things and what their lives are. That opens up these really interesting elements because you suddenly realize that, yeah, at certain times of the day, you can almost guarantee that right now, at least, things like YouTube and Netflix, etc., are starting to go down. I mean, I've even seen that, you know, tonight we had a drop in streaming rate for a little bit because I could just see Twitch's user numbers kind of cranking up in the background. So there's something really interesting that presence teaches you about materiality. Also, more importantly, makes you think about actual humans and how they're using these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No use knowing how something works if you don't know how people are using it.
Yeah.
Personally.
Yeah. Now maybe that's a good starting point to get back to these two voices, because Alexa is not a very interesting character, but Siri is a really chatty character, and I don't know, I really get into her. I really start to like her.
I like her humor.
How's that for you, Wesley? What are these characters, and how come that Amazon's Alexa is so, I don't know, very boring? But how can she be boring? Why does she work? Why does it work for Amazon anyway for her to be that boring? And why does Siri have to be so very chatty and interesting? And I don't know, she seems to be deep. I remember in the beginning when people started using the technology, that they kept asking her very indiscreet or interesting questions, and she tried to give us answers, and I really liked that. So yeah, what's that?
Can I
What's
just intervene, because I've got a question here? Do you agree Siri was more dominant in the performance, like we just discussed? If so, why is Alexa more passive, like a slave? Anything to do with the ancient Bacchus cult?
Nice. Thank you for both questions. Yeah, I mean, Siri is, I mean, like, obviously, none of these things are actual beings, right? I've just programmed this whole thing. That's like, I'm just gonna like put it out there for everyone, because when artists talk about like their smart AI, etc., it really winds me up, because I just feel like you're doing the work of bastards when you do that. You're doing the work of people who make facial recognition technologies that try to tell people, you know, what sexual orientation they are or what ethnicity they are, when you kind of like back up the kind of magic and mystery of those technologies by saying that they are, you know, living, knowing, you know, breathing, smelling, etc. So like Siri is clearly, I mean, it's all programmed by me, actually, except for the Alexa responses. So the reason why Alexa responds the way that it does is that's actually the responses from an Amazon Echo connected to Amazon system for the questions that I'm putting to it through the mechanized, synthesized voice of Siri. So, and what I'm interested in there is to point out, again, the breakages, you know, like when there's this thing that's sold to us as your chatty personal assistant, you know, your friend that lives in your house and helps you order things from Whole Foods, which is also owned by Amazon, you know, that sort of thing. That when we realize that it doesn't work very well and doesn't know much at all, it doesn't know anything and doesn't, you know, and actually, unless you're somebody who has a male identified voice and you're either English or American, you start to get it harder and harder at being able to talk to and be understood by these technologies, almost inevitably. Mostly because they're optimized for the people who made them, effectively. That their biases are baked into how the system works. So, you start asking anywhere near a kind of a conversational question realistically to an Amazon Echo, and you just get, sorry, I'm not sure. And you get that kind of constantly or over and over again. And so I just really wanted to just leave that element in there to keep a reminder of the broken promises of these technologies, because there are strewn with broken promises throughout them. But also just to kind of like make fun of it in a sense as well. Because I don't think, I feel very strongly about all these topics, but doesn't mean I don't want to have a joke about them as well, I mean, I'm English after all. This is how we communicate 5% of everything. Siri, so Alexa is more passive in that sense because of actually how bad it is, and its passivity is exposing its brokenness. How it doesn't function as it's being sold to us. In terms of the Bacchus cult, there's definitely, I mean, the way that Siri talks obviously is being very interested in this notion of Livy and just kind of steering through cults. This piece is actually was originally in an installation that I showed for the first time at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So it was a physical installation, like an office desk. And where the gallery had placed my work was in front of this big, beautiful relief sculpture of a Bacchanalian rite. And I was like, oh, that's cool, big crazy Bacchus thing there. And I just thought, well, it'd be really interesting to refer to it. And as I've now have it exhibited in multiple places, and I tend to try to refer to the space I'm in, but still something about that Bacchanalian mystery cult and the presence of cults and how cultish to some degree, the kind of belief in these things, the faith in their working is. It just seems to make sense to me. So it's really like the Bacchanalian stuff is in there because I like to historicize. I like to remind us all that everything that's happened now has happened before and will happen again, just with slightly different toys around us.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, Lisa?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I do think that there's something that I wanted to kind of like poke, just in terms of what you were saying, Lisa, about your work as well, about the kind of like ontological condition of these things, because I think a lot about, from my position, is one that objectivity is something, an objective knowledge is something that we can't grasp and understand because we can only perceive the world subjectively through our sensory organs. The phenomenal and the noumenal split. That's been something that I kind of like have personally. That's my personal belief about how kind of cognition works and how our understanding of the world works. So for me, subjectivity, individual subjectivity, and sort of situated knowledges as well, the things that we share and the value of our individual positions on things, is actually like a super key part of, how I make the work that I make, what I write, how I teach when I teach as well. And I wonder how that notion of subjectivity and objectivity comes in, and perhaps a notion of like situated knowledges and situated perspectives comes into your studies around waste, because I'm very interested in an understanding and appreciation of what waste is. I saw an amazing show curated by Martina Mutzi and her collaborators in Eindhoven last year that was looking at waste in this beautiful way. Did you see this, Lika?
Yes, I
No,
did. Yeah.
no, I missed it.
Oh,
Yeah.
it was an amazing.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, amazing exhibition, beautifully curated, and that was really pulled at waste as this really incredible object in the world that told us so much about how the world worked, and the work in there was often looking at the tech industry specifically about its relationship to waste. And I wonder whether or not you're kind of thinking about how our subjective experience of waste filters into a more kind of gestalt understanding of what waste is.
Well, first of all, I think that so you speak of subjectivity and also what I keep thinking of is that in philosophy from modernity onwards, we've been asking mostly the question how we can access things via our mental faculties. So we have in a way given up in knowing about how the things are in themselves, or how objects are in themselves, waste objects as well, and have only asked how we can relate to them. So how we relate to them, how we have access to them in a way. And I think that waste specifically demands that we ask how objects relate to us as well, and the ways in which we are. So the question of access and subjectivity is not really important. The objects themselves, they start acting up. There's one waste scholar. She speaks of recalcitrant matter, or so it's forcing our thought. It's acting up. And so the question how do we relate to it, or how do we know it, is in the end not that interesting anymore, because it's relating to us as well, and it's demanding we pay attention to it. So I would say that when we focus on waste, we can get a grasp on the ways in which we humans are being, I don't know, are not on our pedestals anymore. If I could paint a picture of I don't know, modern man, it would be a man, a white man, of course, a man, of course, on a pedestal, and his rational view of things or is all that matters. And then, but now everything is starting to act up, and his rationality and his way of perceiving things and ordering reality, extractivating stuff or ordering nature is not really that interesting anymore, because things are working. I don't know, are acting up. They're demanding attention, and so I think that in my waste scholarship, I'm trying to pay attention to the ways in which waste is demanding attention of all of us. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and it's like it's a provocative idea as well, because that notion of waste, and we can probably get into like what waste is at that point, because there's some really interesting metaphors for what waste is. Who says what is waste? For example, the waste itself is this component that has this kind of like un or overseen element of it, and when these things are acting out, as you put it, and attracting our attention, there is something there about these systems, the voice assistant technologies, for example, that people seem to be obsessed with them. They're sort of desperate to anthropomorphize them and to give them these personalities. And they're also mostly entertained by when they don't quite work right, which I always find really interesting, because then you're sort of seeing the busted edges, and humans are very good at taking whatever tool is made for them and breaking it quite quickly, But that in itself is there's a little bit of an obsession with the acting outness of these technologies as well. The idea of like, what does the machine?
Waste, of course, refers to things not working as we think they should. So they're non-valuable, they're non-useful. In the the current paradigm, that still doesn't sit well. Waste just is not supposed to be. It's supposed to go away.
Or we take it away.
It messes up our dreams, and it messes up things, period. Sorry.
No, it's good. And where humans are in that is really interesting, because obviously the notion of like waste, who takes away the waste, these kind of like hidden, there's all, in these kind of invisible systems, there's always humans really involved in every strata of it. There's humans involved doing the jobs that other people don't want to do, in terms of collecting, processing, redistributing waste. But it's always like, there's humans like, there's the person with with a hand pistol patrolling around the outside of an underground data center in Ohio somewhere. There's all these bodies that are placed in there who also get wrapped up into this notion of not being seen as part of those systems when they're kept a distance from us. That's kind of the saddest thing for me, is about how there's an obsession with revealing the invisible around the system, but very rarely, if ever, apart from in really good work, like people like Ingrid Burrington's work, I think does this, of looking at where the kind of bodies are as a way of like getting around the notion of invisibility and going straight for who's the humans involved and what does that tell us about this thing. What does their experiences of these systems really tell us about what's going on with them?
Yeah. And I think that's what's most important nowadays, to focus on these. So to focus on, I don't know, the ways in which things are not functioning smoothly, and not the ways in which we stop buying stuff, we stop flying around the world, we stop, I don't know, stop getting more efficient, more and I think that these Corona times are in that sense very interesting, because now all the system stops functioning. And but then again, it seems like online we're now trying to maintain a sense of smoothness and functioning. It feels like from day one there was a push to make sure that I at home would function almost as good as in the office or whatever. And the same goes for my 9-year-old. So we're all supposed to forget what's happening, the non-functioning, the non-going smoothly, and keep at it, keep at it. So I don't, I do think we should try and keep finding ways to put stuff in the machine and break it and say,
the worry is always who breaks with the machine. I think is always so you've always got to be like very careful about how you navigate that topic. I think that I do think that there is a really, I think it feels very very natural, if I can use a really complicated word in this context, for humans to want to, when their normal structure is taken away, for them to try to rebuild it real quick. I think unfortunately we're probably going to see more of this maybe in our lifetimes, of the ways that people try to rebuild what was recently lost. What you described there is a good example of what I think is a very natural response, to just be like, my roof is gone in a metaphorical sense, I'll try and put a new roof, rather than think about what a roof could be next, But I think that those things do come with time, because obviously depending on the situation, depending on the crisis, we don't actually have the capacity to be able to like roll it back at all or recreate what we had. There's a lot of people doing good, interesting work looking about what after abundance might be. Superflux comes to mind, I think that there's that it's a really this time right now is kind of showing us a little kind of glimpse into that, obviously, but in a very in what is, for in many senses, quite a safe way. I don't say that to deprecate the experience of people who are suffering right now, but like in the sense that obviously we all know it could be loads worse, and a lot of the predictions have, up until this point were that it would be much worse. It's not this communicative, and also has the lethality of MERS, for example, that sort of thing. So I think, do we have some questions in?
I was just going to say we have 3 questions, or 2 questions and 1 remark. What role do you think our faith in technology plays in our consumerist behavior and the environment? And do you think these times will offer an opportunity to shift this attitude to a more sustainable one?
What do you think, Lisa? That seems in your ballpark.
Well, it will not go. We will have to, I don't know.
Can I?
I'm not. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
No.
I read an article yesterday about how everybody sees something in these times and puts their idea on it. So we think, oh, maybe we can shift this attitude to a more sustainable one, but more right-wing politicians see it as a chance to close the borders, or so. I think it really depends on your viewpoint, but yeah, I wonder what you think, Lisa.
Of course, never waste a good crisis. I think that goes for this crisis as well. I don't know. It's also, there's all these paradoxes going on. I must say that I myself very much enjoy the relative peace and quiet that these days bring. And then I walk outside and there's less cars, and I live in Amsterdam, so there's less airplanes, and of course the sky was very blue, so that's great. But then my boyfriend remarked that because of there's less particulate matter in the air, we're in probably for a very, very hot summer, because the particulate matter, I don't know, the reflection going on less so now because we're not exhausting a lot. So then, I don't know, there seems to be all these things going on, working simultaneously. And I'm unsure. Of course, that we're now not doing a lot is probably doing good for the environment. I think the animals are doing great. That's at least in Venice, I saw dolphins, and around I see a lot of birds, more than usually, I think. So they're, I don't know, reclaiming their territory or something. But then I'm not sure if this changes anything. If I look at the way that most people are reacting, they're trying to be very productive still, and I think that's very much a problem. And I'm unsure how to get out of that predicament. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe if I repeat the first part of the question again. What role do you think our faith and technology plays in our consumerist behavior and the environment? And Lisa, you in your essay and Beyond Ourselves, you also talk about consumerist behavior in relationship to waste. Maybe we can also talk about waste and technology, or yeah.
Well, one thing is, of course, technology will not save us in this, will not save us, of course. So you mentioned, Wesley, two laws, Moore's law and Kumi's law. So Moore's law is then, so of course, technology progresses and get more efficient. And then Kumi's law says, okay, power consumption will go down. But then, as you pointed out in your performance, it will not go down as much. So this reminded me of Jevons Paradox, which promises us that as things get more efficient, we will use less. We will use less resources. But as it turns out, so this is Jevons Paradox. As we get more efficient with our resources, consumption goes up. So we cannot consume our way out of this problem. We cannot use technology to get out of it. So maybe one of the lessons would be that if you talk about faith, that no one can save us. Corona cannot save us. Technology cannot save us. I don't know. I don't know who should. So change should come from somewhere, but I think nobody's really sure what the change should be. So maybe a first step would be not to put our faith in either progress or technology. And I think the two are quite synonymous at the moment still. Maybe that would be a first step to try and stop progressing and try and stop putting our faith in technology as I don't know, Alexa and Siri cannot save us. AI cannot save us.
And also you refer to Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble. Also, in your essay, you referred to her as in, you also said, well, change doesn't come from one crisis. After things won't change after one crisis. Things change, evolve, and also what Donna Haraway said, staying with the trouble. So be mindful of what is happening right now, if I paraphrase it correctly.
And this reminds me of a series that I very much enjoyed, Mr. Robot. And so Mr. Robot, how should I introduce this series? About internet hackers who try to save the world from a big capitalist, consumerist conglomerate that's dominating the world, and they try to hack it into it. And to change the system. But at one point, the main character, Mr. Robot, says, well, change doesn't, it's a slow process, and it's exhausting. So it doesn't happen overnight. So that's one thing. But what I found is that I very much enjoyed looking at Mr. Robot and feeling that I was, in looking at this series, part of this change. You know, I very much felt the hatred for this company that ruined us all, this very wrong capitalist company. But then I was just consuming. I was just watching the series and very much enjoying this talk about change being very hard and blah blah blah, etc. So maybe that's a first step to maybe ditch the big ideals that make us feel good. So change and progress as far as Siri and Alexa are concerned, I don't know, the ideal of living on forever, maybe in AI, immortality. So take a step back and get a bit modest, and we cannot change a lot, and we cannot change a lot in a short time. It's exhausting. It's an exhausting process.
Yeah. And of course, there's like the two types of change, right? There's like the change that comes, super slow, and look at like the history of revolutions in the last like 300 years in the West, at least. Almost did it in my hand.
Well done.
That you see that these large scale changes that happened from the French Revolution onwards, you could see that the kind of like the kind of march of history, but like that led up to it with all the and you can see the kind of struggles that very few of those things happen just overnight. So that yes, there is like change that happens at this kind of like glacial pace you don't really see until it's happened. But then right now we're living in an interesting moment that proves that there is a really present other kind of change, where suddenly the next day, like a week ago here, as I'm sure it probably was in the Netherlands as well, and a lot of other places in Europe, every day it was like, right, what's going to happen today? Yeah. What is it? Is this the day that all the pubs close? Is this the day that we can't go out of the house anymore? It's like that's large scale change that's totally transformative, will leave an impression on a great deal of people for the rest of their lives, some of them in a really horrific fashion. And that just, that's the sort of thing that just comes in from above. So there are, it's interesting, because I was always somebody who just thought, well, top down change was always, people always push back against it, and it never really sticks, or rather just causes more struggle. And it's normally about grassroots shift. I've got a history in direct action activism, which is often a lot of what they're kind of based on, is the fact that you're trying to create this sort of like grassroots movements and slow pushes towards changes of policy, etc. But this is a really interesting one to see, like, this is how power reacts to these sorts of situations, and how the forms of power that we had when they are in place, they can still make these very transformative changes that happen.
Yeah.
At the, just the difference between you going to bed in one world and waking up the next morning in a different one.
Yeah, but how do you feel about that? Because there's probably in the next couple of weeks going to be a lot of transformative changes that we can do nothing about, or who's going to get the big bucks?
Yeah,
and how is that going to change the world for years to come?
Yeah.
I don't feel like I have any say in that.
I mean, we sort of don't, to a large degree, right? I mean, I think the reason why these particular changes work so well is, I mean, at least for example, in the UK, before they put in formal stuff around not going to the pub, which in England's like, not going to the pub, goodness me, that sort of thing. So before that came down from a higher level, you saw people already doing it. People were kind of looking after themselves in a sense, and we're just kind of going, I think this is rationally good for me. That this is, and that's the kind of key thing, is that like a lot of what's happening now actually serves people's notions of survivability, which is obviously like right high up there in the list of things you want to be paying attention to and taking care of. That the notion of bodily threat, that like these things are kind of like in some way serving our baser needs or baser interests, that we don't really care about what a particular government thinks about it. It's like, we will go along with this because we think that this serves our personal interests at a baser level, and of our loved ones and kids and grandparents, etc. So I think that's why that's a slightly interesting element to this, that's not just like, we're not all just like sheep obeying the rules. Obviously these were like oppressive gestures, and there are people pushing back against them in different parts of the world anyway. I mean, that happened in the UK as well. People refused to self-isolate because they didn't believe that it was true, or they believe that it's a like a conspiracy or whatever insane thing people are doing this week with it because they're bored at home and making shit up. I think there's some really interesting, we're learning a lot, it feels like right now. I think that's the only good thing, realistically, is that hopefully we're learning a lot.
Can I get back to the questions and a remark? This one is a remark. Waste is something unwanted, but that is something relative depending on place, time, opinions. This may change. This may change at certain points. Something unwanted may be needed and to become precious, like some toxic waste may still contain valuable metals, and once they become rare, it becomes valuable. That's the remark. So do you want to respond to that, Lisa?
Yes, of course. So waste is, of course, a relative thing. There is nothing essential to waste. That's what makes it so very interesting to study. So if you inquire into the ontology of waste, then you'll find that it's that there's nothing, there's no such thing as waste. What you do find maybe is that, and maybe this is a way to get back also to the performance, there is a way in which waste refers to ecology. So waste is always the waste of something, and if all goes well, it will nourish in a way. So things will go to waste, they will lose their identity, they will lose their form, and in so doing can become something else and become something new. So in a way, it refers to the, I don't know, to the process of life and death, to mortality, to ephemerality. So things are always only there for a certain amount of time, and then they decay again, and then they become something else. So in that sense, they're relative. What is interesting is to look in the ways in which some forms of things that we call waste nowadays, such as nuclear waste and of course plastics, they seem to be in between life and death. They've been called zombie material. So they're living on, but they're not really dying. So they're in between. And this in between period is, I don't know, that's very interesting, and that's the waste that's, I don't know, that gets stuck in our throats nowadays. So it's the zombie material, the in between life and death, and that's not very nourishing, or not yet. It might become nourishing in the future, but it's not very digestible. So yes, waste is relative, but then there's these certain things nowadays that are in between, and therefore, I don't know, special, or yeah, that demand attention. So in that sense, they're haunting us. They demand our attention. So there's something not going right there. Yeah.
Another question for you, Lisa. These networks also make invisible the quantity of waste and carbon footprint they produce. Is this something you have been working on?
On the carbon footprints?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
What I think is very interesting is the way in which nowadays we try to...
sorry to intervene. The question says these networks, and I think these networks relates to the networks of, well, Siri and Alexa, for example.
Yeah, so the footprints of Siri and Alexa.
I think so.
Yeah.
It would sort of read to me that the question says the networks of like waste disposal, I think is what.
Oh yeah.
It's making, because the networks that deal with the waste make invisible the quantity of waste and carbon footprint use. I sort of assume that that's the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
What I think is very interesting there is we very much try nowadays to get our carbon footprint right, and to make sure that it's as small as possible. And that I think is problematic in a way too, because then you try to, I don't know, calculate your way out of things. So to make things calculable is to get a grip, and then to know what you're supposed to do. So it would be a way to reduce ethics to calculation. So if you can decide what's the right amount of CO2 that you can use up, then you know what you can do. So that's a problematic thing. On the other hand, I think that it is interesting to try and calculate anyway, because it especially where Siri and Alexa and other internet things are concerned, we tend to conceive of them as invisible or as immaterial, when in fact they're very much material and have a lot of effects. And the same goes for all the things we buy and we consume. There's a lot of invisible effects and costs that are in the end that are very important to get into sight in a way. Then again, we should never try to find a way to calculate our way out of it, you know, and then feel this is the right carbon footprint, and now I'm in the clear, now I'm a good person or something, and now I've done my job, now I'm there. And the last step is, I think, a very, very problematic one. And I do think that in all this calculating practices, we do try and find to get it exactly right. Whereas I would say is to leave carbon footprints. We cannot, I don't know, we make waste, that's what we do. We should ask, however, what kinds of waste we make and what kind of networks we are involved in, and how to do that right. But there's no tool for that, you know. You have to, I don't know, feel in the dark and think for yourself.
I think there's a remark here which kind of refers to that as well. It says, I think the problem about all these environmental campaigns, they all talk about the future, creating the better version of ourselves that we might never be. It creates an illusion for people in the future that one day everyone will understand the problem. It does create procrastination in this case. What we need to start learning to live in the world we have now. It's not perfect, but we should accept it without the illusions. Yes, big hello to Wes from IDC students.
Yeah, so glad my students have got even come on here and heckle me. Yeah, I think that's a really that's from Anna, who Anastasia. She's a really interesting VR and AR artist. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, I think, about the notion of procrastination, of like a little bit of knowledge about a topic that's quite complex. I think gives people a notion of satisfaction, that they're kind of in the know, and then they can sort of switch off. There's some, you know, certain books I've read on, you know, topics around like the kind of complexities around digital culture, for example, that tend not, you know, they kind of give people a sense that they're authorities, but never ask them to do anything about it, you know. But I think that's always a problematic way to frame knowledge, as being like, it's enough to know, you don't actually have to do anything about it. You know, again, from a direct action point of view, like that's kind of like the opposite of how it works, is that once you know enough, there's probably like an ethical imperative that we might say that there is to do something about it. And I think there can be a little bit infantilizing or sterilizing sometimes to
and of course individualizing. So we all get very scared and guilty and shameful individuals, and we very much like to do the right thing, and so somebody sells us the right thing, and then we feel good individually, and we think, oh my god, I've done right, great, thanks, and then we stop doing shit. So the individualizing especially, I think, is very problematic, and that's I think that's what's captured in this footprint as well. It's an individual footprint. We're not looking at what's happening collectively or what we're doing as a collective. We're only trying to get a grip on our own personal shit, and then feel good or bad about it. And of course we feel bad, and then we get to buy things that make us feel good, and then or we get paralyzed. And then keep on going.
This is maybe also interesting question, also back to the performance, but it also relates to this. A question for Wesley: have you considered putting hope on the shopping list, and how does hope relate to faith in your work?
That's
good question.
Yeah, maybe hope's the next one for Alexa to not recognize until you on a shopping list for you. You know, that's the thing, is like it's always like, oh, I don't know what you mean. As soon as you ask it to put something on a shopping list, it's like, oh, I've put it on a shopping list for you, you know. So yeah, hope, I mean, because I would say maybe hope and faith is an interesting one. I would be working with the definitions of hope, faith as being something that you believe will happen, but you don't need to have seen happen before. You know, a faith doesn't need proof, doesn't need evidence of it. And hope is the hope that something will happen, but there's a doubt in there, right? That you've not, it's not yet been proven to you, and you're still entertaining the fact that it might not occur. And I think that's something really interesting. That the line between those two things is something super fascinating to me, which makes me think this might also be at least somebody who's seen me talk before, because I feel like I ramble into this like a bit at whatever point. It's probably a student who's had to put up with like a lot of me just going, what about the difference between hope and faith, everyone? You know, because that's a fun thing to have a conversation with 30 people who barely know. But I think that there is there's for me personally, I think that faith is a word that I use to describe, you know, the way these systems are working, and the way that that some people believe that they are functioning as they say, in spite of the fact that all the evidence to the contrary is in front of them. But I mean, hope for me, like, you know, I make stuff like this not because I want to point and say boo, You know, I make things because I think that there's a real value in using art practice and the work of what the art object does to provoke a kind of unfinished thinking, you know, something that doesn't get resolved quickly and stays with an audience. I mean, that's something that I think is interesting about the transitory nature of performance, because obviously I do a lot of installation work as well, which is, you know, fixed in a different way. But performance has this immediacy to it, which I think in some sense impacts the knowledge that gets produced through it in a different way, that it's, you know, can be remodeled by your memory of it, which may not be accurate, but you're kind of making it more interesting by misremembering it, because you're filling in gaps based on your own experiences of who you are, which is one of the, why I still, after 25 years or so, oh God, yeah, 20 years or something of being a performer, it still sticks with me as something that's interesting, because, oh, the person says they're not a student, but they take it
I
as
think I know who it is.
okay, I mean, I love my students, so that is definitely a compliment, because they're all wonderful humans. There is, yeah, there's something there that I think that hope needs to stay in our work in these spaces, because if we don't have like a hope that in spite of how things look, that we can perhaps either A, make a difference, or B, contribute at the right time when we see the opportunity come up for us, then kind of like, what are we doing? Why don't we just stay in bed and consume less? Or, you know, just go and volunteer in a homeless shelter for 16 hours a day instead. You know, I think that if you're not kind of thinking that you can hopefully contribute something positive, I don't know, is there anything that keeps me getting out of bed of a morning, to be honest?
Talking about art, could you tell us a bit more about the visuals?
Oh, with pleasure. Thank you for teaming me up for that. So the visuals, I would like to really thank Sougwen, who's an amazing performer and visual artist, who a lot of people might be familiar with. She does a project called Drawing Operations, where she built a robot arm, effectively, that she trained on her own drawing, history of her own drawing, and now draws with it. And she's kind of provoking this question of who's collaborating with who, or like what she phrases it really beautifully by saying that, you know, she doesn't see these things as creators. You know, she's like written all of her own machine learning stuff. She doesn't see it as a creator because she knows that she built it. You know, the robot arm isn't the author, but what she says is, and I'm hoping I'm not going to misquote her here, that these things are they spark, you know, new forms of human creativity. I certainly find that when I'm working with machine learning and AI tools, I go, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily have made that come out myself if someone had asked me what should come out the end of the system. I've seen something strange come out of it, and that's kind of provoked me into a new way of thinking. It's not the author, I still am, but it's that, you know, our relationship to those things gets really much more interesting at that point when we think of these tools as being you know, something that inspires us rather than something that does the work in and of itself. And the visuals were, I'd asked her very nicely to, if she would like to collaborate with me on this project. We've been talking about doing collaboration for a while. And she was intrigued enough with the concept after seeing the installation of it, that she produced these amazing visuals, which are really exploring or responding in her way to the notion of what the body is in these spaces, you know, of like these assistants as being digital voices without digital bodies, but there's an assumption that there's a body in there, or they're often, you know, approached as if they've got a body, and the notion of disembodiment is really wrapped up into all their technologies in this really interesting way. So she was pulling out both this presence of what this digital body is by using these very traditional digital models for bodies, which are very widely distributed. Those are the models that she's playing with a lot in that thing. But she's also bringing in her own drawing practice. You know, she's a drawer, kind of, you know, as a base art practice. Everything else is kind of what she draws alongside or with, but she is a drawer in and of herself. So she's much, you know, much in the same way that I was using just the material of the sound, of the voices itself to make the soundtrack. You know, she was kind of playing around with this other thing of what isn't there that she can bring in to the live visuals. And, you know, I really loved what she did for it. And I'm extremely thankful. Thank you very much, Sougwen.
and also this should have been a live performance. Could you tell us a bit more about the setup of this live stream? What was different than the live performance? Maybe
Sure.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the last time I performed this was at Berghain in Berlin for CTM Festival this year in January, and that was funny because it's kind of interesting playing Berghain. It's got very good sound system. And to be honest, practically speaking, for me, not much, because I'm still live, doing all the same stuff live I was in the stream that I did then, except that I had a big projector behind me that the screen was showing rather than, streaming the screen off. I think it's really interesting to work in streaming media now, because then we can kind of think, okay, now this is not just something that galleries or art institutions don't really want to deal with, because live streams is a bit fiddly to set up, etc., etc. It's not as good as getting people in a room, etc., etc. Those things that's not necessarily true. I mean, some of these people asking questions today, for example, may not have been able to, may not have had the levels of privilege possibly to get access to the room where this otherwise would have been hosted. So I think there is like really valuable things to think about, how this moment that we're living through is definitely one where there's a lot of opportunity to experiment with new forms of change. And can I also just take this opportunity to say thank you very much, Lika, for staying with the project, because obviously things were being cancelled left, right, and centre. I had 2 other exhibitions / performances cancelled for this month. And it was really nice that you were really up for doing something harder and, taking a risk on how to set up a Twitch stream and how to get bitrate streaming correct. And, I've really enjoyed it. And it's been really nice to have Lisa being able to be telepresently present as well.
Yeah, thank you, because I'm really enjoying this, and I'm really happy we could continue with the performance, and even maybe reaching a larger audience. So I'm really happy with that.
Should we wrap it up on that?
Yeah, we've been talking about more than an hour, so maybe we should.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Lika.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Wesley.
Um,
maybe maybe some, yeah. I don't know how long this crisis will take, but maybe we can do this another time.
Yeah, I think there's a possibility that I'm doing more of these live stream performances as well. Yeah, I like it. It's nice. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Great, and thank you to everybody who's been asking questions and making comments and stuff. That's really nice. That's a really cool part of
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, awesome. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.